Welcome to the Inclusion Think Tank podcast, where we talk about inclusive education, why it works, and how to make it happen. A note from the host. As this and several future episodes were pre-recorded, you will hear references to New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education, also known as NJCIE, which has since undergone a name change to All In for Inclusive Education. Please note that, although it has a new name, All In for Inclusive Education is still doing its usual awesome things. On today's episode, I welcome my guest, Dr. Shri Rao, who is a professor at the Department of Special Education, Language, and Literacy at the College of New Jersey. We discuss the importance of embracing welcoming first-person narratives, perspectives, and practices that affirm neurodiversity. I would like to welcome everyone back to a new episode of the Inclusion Think Tank podcast, brought to you by New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education. I'm your host, Arthur Aston, and today I am joined by my guest, Shri. So Shri, thank you for joining me. I am so happy to connect with you and to have this conversation today.
Thank you, Arthur, for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
So to start our conversation, can you share a little bit about your story? Tell us who you are and about the work that you do, and how you discovered that you were interested in the world of inclusive education.
So my name is Shri Rao, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Special Ed, Language and Literacy at the College of New Jersey. I teach courses for pre-service teachers as well as in-service teachers. And the courses focus mostly on positive behavior supports, on research in special education, as well as foundations of special education. My journey in terms of what brought me to inclusive education, I'd have to go back to early 1980s when I was working in a segregated school for students with disabilities in India. And the children that I was teaching were children with complex disabilities, many of whom were non-speaking. And it was there, as a new teacher, I just felt a strong dissonance with the ways in which the children, my students, were being viewed, the kinds of programs that we were subjecting the children to. I just intuitively felt that my students had a lot to offer, but the language, the professional lenses that were used to view my students seemed like did not offer any space to look at them differently. So there was a growing dissatisfaction within me, and I decided to pursue graduate school. So I came to Syracuse University to do my master's and then continued on to doctoral work. And that's where Syracuse University, is a leader and has been a leader in inclusive education. And it was my exposure through coursework there and exposure to the advocacy work that was going on there that really got me interested and excited. But over the course of my time in doing graduate work, I was also exposed to disability as a social and cultural construction, moving away from the purely medical model. So that too got me interested in terms of how people narrate disability, how they understand disability, how do we construct disability as we know it in different spaces and so forth. So currently, in terms of my interests, I have wide interests. I have a deep interest and ongoing interest in inclusive education. I also have interests in working and collaborating with families, especially culturally diverse families. I am also interested in disability development and culture. A lot of my work focuses on disability in South Asia. And most recently, I did a Fulbright study in India 2 years back that focused on understandings of autism from the perspective of Indian families. So I hope I didn't talk too much, but that captures. Um, and just to add, I have worked in local school districts to support students with who were labeled as having behavioral challenges, students with complex disabilities. I think a lot of that kind of work also uh, further reinforced my passion for inclusive education.
You did not talk too much at all. I loved every step of of what you said. Every piece of what you said led you to where you are today. So that is that's really great. And to know that that you've done work in India, and to address the cultural differences and things related to different cultures, and the culture in India. That's really great, really cool to hear. So this season, as I have shared with you, and for those of you who may be listening or watching the podcast, this season of the podcast, we are highlighting some of our presenters from our summer inclusion conference that took place back in June. So you were one of those presenters, and the topic of your presentation was neurodiversity, affirming perspectives and practices for supporting children with autism in the classroom. So it's kind of multi-layered question, I guess. So can you explain the difference between a deficit-based perspective and an affirming-based perspective, and how you can describe a diagnosis like autism?
Yeah, that's a great question, Arthur. A deficit-based perspective on autism focuses on what the children are lacking, the skills that they don't have. Deficit-based perspectives often compare student performance or current skills or actions to a particular norm, and often those norms are neurotypical norms. Deficit perspectives also pathologize regular human differences. They tend to see the actions of children with autism as representing a pathology that needs to be remediated, fixed, intervened. Again, it goes back to the sense of the norm. And deficit perspectives have been a part of the history of the dominant understandings of autism right from Leo Kanner's time. He was the person in the 1940s who introduced the term extreme autistic aloneness, and he talked about the inability of these students to relate in regular ways. And that inability has continued to feature even in the current Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 diagnostic criteria of autism. And even in the current criteria, you see inability to maintain relationships, deficits in social emotional reciprocity. And that's kind of over time also led to grand narratives, such as people with autism have difficulty with empathy. They see the trees, not the forest. They don't have the ability to see the big picture, and the tendency to conflate autism with cognitive impairment. So these broad narratives represent the deficit-based perspectives. To continue on to affirming perspectives in contrast have some key characteristics. When I think of the term affirming, I think of places and spaces where I am welcomed, where I'm wanted, where I'm honored, where I'm respected. And I would say that's one of the key aspects of affirming perspectives towards children with autism. A major aspect is also an affirming perspective centers the knowledge of people with autism. So we are knowledge production and autism often comes from professionals, often comes from fields such as psychology, psychiatry, medicine. But it's important that we center the knowledge and perspectives of people who are straddling and living that condition and navigating it in a world that is often disaffirming and doesn't understand what their experiences and perspectives are. So I would say a key core aspect of an affirming perspective is whose knowledge are we valuing? Who are we listening to? Whose voices are at the center of our work? And I think related to that is presumption of competence. Really important. No matter what you see on the outside, right? Uh, no matter what the external uh, not facade, external appearances might be, you have to always presume that the student has the capacity to learn, that the student is aware, that the student is knowing, can know. I think those assumptions are really important. And the third quality of affirming practices is that we focus on changing the environment. The questions we ask are not, what can we do to fix this kid? The questions we ask are, what can we do to restructure, reimagine the environment, the classroom environment, the environment of the school? What can we do to reimagine our relationships, our interactions with the child? How can we do it differently in a way that honors the neurodiversity of the child? And that would be the fourth aspect, right? Looking at the different ways of acting, emoting, behaving, thinking, not as a pathology, but basically an expression of diversity, and an expression of the variation in terms of the different ways that we think, that we emote. So I think that would be one of the core principles of affirming practices. And I forgot to mention this right at the beginning. I think it's important to just share my position. I am a non-autistic researcher and teacher who has interests in the area of autism. So I don't claim to be the expert here. Like I said, uh, I think we need to center the voices of people with autism. So I bring my interests in this area, but I would not necessarily consider myself the expert in the area. Yeah, I hope I answered the question.
You did. Thank you so much for sharing the differences between those two, the deficit and the affirming, uh, practices and perspectives. And I wanted to make sure that I brought that up and had you share those differences because, as I shared with you, um, one of my passions in life through this podcast and other work that I do is to change the way that people view those of us living with disabilities. And oftentimes, people look at people with disabilities through a deficit-based type of lens of what we can't do, what we're unable to do, and that needs to change. Yeah, as you said, presuming competence, and no matter what you may think you see on the outside of someone, just presume the competence that they have the ability to do things until they tell you otherwise, or until you're informed of it, of otherwise. So, thank you so much for for sharing that the differences between the two. And you started talking about this in your answer, but can you share some specific examples of neurodiversity affirming perspectives and practices that can be used by educators in the classroom?
So moving on to practices, I think I would bring the practices emerge from the lenses we use. And I think I would come back to those lenses, right? So, for example, behavior is often automatically something. It's a descriptor for autism. It's automatically kind of attached to that diagnostic category, and there is a tendency to describe children with autism as having problem behaviors, quote unquote, challenging behaviors. And then our interventions often focus on how to prevent those behaviors, how to react those behaviors. But I think when you use a neurodiversity affirming lens, you are changing that lens itself in terms of how you're approaching the actions of the child. And a lot of autistic advocates and self-advocates in their personal narratives have talked about how stressful it is to encounter environments which are neurodiversity disaffirming on a daily basis, to be in environments that challenge the challenge who you are, and that kind of put pressure on you to mask who you are, to suppress who you are, and to be in those situations day in, day out is stressful. So we really, in terms of changing the lens, it goes back to what I said before. We need to think about how do we change our environments? How do we change our responses when we empathize with the child and we understand what the experience of the child is, and we view that behavior as communicative, then our reaction to it and our approach to it is going to change. And so it's important to understand what it is to be in neurodiversity disaffirming environments on a daily basis, and think about how can we change our instructional practices, our environments, our expectations, and so forth. So that's one. In terms of specific practices, I would also say, again, related to a lens, is who writes the goals and objectives for children with autism? Who's involved in formulating those goals? And do those goals take into consideration the voice of that student and their experience of and their neurodiversity? Uh, Many of the goals that are written for kids with autism are often goals that focus on changing who they are, like, getting them to engage in eye contact. Many folks with autism in their personal narratives have talked about how difficult eye contact is and how hard it is in a conversation to engage in eye contact, to look out for nonverbal cues that the person might be giving in terms of their stance in that conversation, to look at different aspects of that conversation and engage in eye contact. And some of them have mentioned how overwhelming it can be. So I often ask why over eye contact is overrated. It is a neurotypical goal, and we are often imposing that on children with autism. We need to consult and co-collaborate with students with autism and their families to come up with goals that make sense for them. So those would be two things. The third thing I would say, communication is a major aspect. I think we need to provide access to communication. We need to honor the choices with regard to the mode of communication that children want to use or students want to use. We need to integrate, we need to make available that mode of communication in every environment and setting that the child is in. I still come across children or teenagers who clearly have difficulties with communication and haven't been given access to another mode of communication, and that's unconscionable.
Yes, thank you for that. It's really as you said, it depends on what lens we're looking through, and that
Yeah.
really can have the has great potential to impact the way that we literally the way that we view things. So it's
Yeah.
yeah, so that's
Yeah.
really good.
And flexibility is so important.
Yes.
Let's not get rigid. Let's not let those yardsticks and norms that we have. We need to reconsider the norms against which we compare our children, including children with autism. We often assume that the norms for social interaction, for play, for all of these different aspects of development are universal. And that's the only way to move forward, not necessarily.
Yes, the flexibility is so important because every student is an individual, and they will everybody learns differently. We I remember back in school when I was in school, it was, are you a visual learner or auditory learner? Everybody learns in different ways. They process and take in information in so many different ways. So we can't I would say it's important that we not focus on, again, the rigid part of things, and to be more
Yeah.
flexible and adaptive to each student that we are, that we're working with. So thank you for, including that. So the last question I have for you, we are through all of the podcast episodes that I have recorded, putting together a resource guide with suggestions from our guests on the podcast. So, can you offer any resources for our listeners that will help them better understand autism and or the affirming perspectives and practices that you've mentioned in this discussion?
Yeah, so Arthur, I am developing a resource list that includes both articles as well as books, as well as podcasts and blogs and so forth. So I'd be happy to share with you. You mentioned in terms of anyone who wants to learn more about autism, I would direct them to first person narratives. I find them the most powerful. And there over the last I would say 3 or 4 decades, we have had a steady stream of first person first person narratives by autistic people. So Naoki Higashida's book, The Reason I Jump, is a great place to start from. But there are also Tito Mukhopadhyay has written more than one book about his personal experiences. Then there is Chammi Rajapatirana. And then more recently, there are documentaries. Like just before this podcast, I was looking up a documentary that features Jordan Zimmerman, who is an autistic, identifies as an autistic advocate, and her journey. I think that would be my recommendation for the starting place. And it goes back to let's let's begin, let's center the knowledge. of people who live with this condition, and let's begin learning from them. Let's start our learning from there. And what's exciting is more recently, there are websites that feature SLPs, speech language pathologists, and other therapists who are neurodivergent themselves, who identify as being neurodivergent, and who recommend uh, practices that are neurodiversity affirming. I think those are also some places that I have found some interesting perspectives, as well as some really good critiques of the typical ways in which we approach supporting children with autism. So I can send you that list that I have, if that would be helpful to you.
Yes, that would be very helpful. And thank you so much. And I really appreciate that, you saying the first person perspective, and hearing from and including the voices of those who live with, these diagnoses like autism is, the best place to, get accurate information. Because again, as I mentioned, everyone is so different. As they say, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with
That's
autism.
right.
Because the next
That's
person
right.
you meet, it has a totally different,
Yeah,
life that they live, and how it impacts their life. So to hear the
yeah,
different perspectives and real life stories firsthand directly from these individuals is, always the best way to learn more and to educate ourselves. So thank you for that. And we will include your list in our list. And so that's
yeah.
great.
I will share that with you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yes. So
It,
thank you so much for this conversation. It was great to meet you and to talk with you, and to, share this conversation with you for our podcast episode. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
was a pleasure speaking to you, Arthur, and I enjoyed this conversation. Thank you again for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome, and I will be in touch with you soon. We thank you for listening to this episode of the Inclusion Think Tank podcast. This podcast is brought to you by All In for Inclusive Education. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Stay tuned for new episodes of the podcast premiering every 2 weeks. We're all in. Are you?